Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of Kaya and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe.
In this episode, Bill catches up with Randy Cohen, a seasoned educator who has taught investments and alts at Harvard Business School for 25 years. Randy dives into the current state of education and how the pace of technological change is disrupting the job market, leading to stress on educational institutions to keep up with new demands. He also explores the use of AI technology in education and recommends a book that predicted the invention of the iPad, Amazon Unbound by Jeff Bezos. This insightful discussion easily shifts to his thoughts on entrepreneurship and how private equity can add value to public markets. Listen in.
Randy Cohen, great honor to have you on the show today.
So great to be here.
I remember coming into your HBS class in entrepreneurship, and it was a very interesting experience. I remember walking into the classroom with you, and my last question before we met the students was, how do these students get funded? And you turned to me and said, basically the LP. So it was a very interesting beginning, but it was awesome to see these students. And I think you said a lot of them go on to pursue these various projects post-graduation, which was quite remarkable too. But I want to talk about that perhaps a little bit, but maybe just a bit of a background on who Randy Cohen is.
Sure. Grew up in Philadelphia. I was a math nerd. I studied math in college at Harvard. And that's where I found out how good at math the people are who are really good at math, and said, okay, this is not the thing for me. The other thing I spent my time on in college was parliamentary debate. And that was my great joy. Every weekend I'd go to a debate tournament. And in my 20s, had this thought, boy, if I could find a field that put together this verbal logic and discussion and argument with the math element, but without it being the pure math where I just can't keep up with the best of the best, I might have a career I really enjoyed and could add value in. And I started out working as an actuary, a management consultant, but in the process of that, you take a long series of exams, and they introduced an exam track on finance. And it was, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen Paris? I mean, this finance was so unbelievably fascinating compared to actuarial stuff. And I liked actuarial stuff, but finance was just on a whole nother level. You start learning Black-Scholes, you learn the capital asset pricing model. You're like, this is the greatest thing ever. And so went and got a PhD at University of Chicago, studied with the great Eugene Fama there, unbelievable intellectual experience, just so wonderful and exciting. Was lucky enough to get a job teaching at Harvard Business School. And that was 25 years ago, almost literally 25 years ago today. And other than a few years spent down the river at MIT Sloan, which was also terrific, but now I'm back at HBS and I've spent the career here. And then other things about me, I guess, worth knowing is I certainly work a lot in the asset management business. I mostly taught investments over my career, and I teach the alternative investments course for HBS Online. And anybody who wants to really learn alternative investments, that HBS Online course, I highly, highly recommend. I co-taught it with Arthur Siegel and Victoria Ivashina. I think it's a fantastic introduction to the field. And in addition, I'm super interested in sports and in particular pro basketball. And I published probably about 1,000 pages of writing on the subject under the name Blind Loyalty 76 on the Liberty Ballers website, the SB Nation site for my hometown 76ers. I do a lot of work related to blindness. I'm blind. I have a podcast called Dangerous Vision, where I interview fascinating people with some connection of some kind to blindness. And I think that's a lot of fun. It's not depressing or anything. It's really just interesting to hear about these people. The blindness is almost just an excuse to have some of the most interesting people on. The world's greatest sleight of hand magician just happens to be blind. So I have him on. And then, as you mentioned, I've gotten really into entrepreneurship. I switched from teaching most of the time investments, which I taught at both Harvard and MIT. When I came back to Harvard, I created a course called Field X, which is a course where students start businesses while they're in school. And I have about 100 teams a year of students. And I would say typically a few dozen of them, those become real funded businesses. And we've had 3 unicorns out of the class that have raised money, substantial money at valuations in excess of $1 billion, and lots of other success stories. So it's the greatest job in the world. I'm just so lucky to have it. And of course, mentors like you come to the class and give the students wisdom and advice, and occasionally do, in fact, invest in them. And if anybody listening to this is interested in being a Field X mentor, we'd sure love to talk to you.
Yeah, it is a great platform. It's the closest I'll ever get to being admitted into the hallowed halls of Harvard. But at this age, this stage of my life, I'll take what I can get. Is there any particular of these unicorns, Randy, anyone you could name?
So the first one is especially dear to my heart. Guy came into my office. This is maybe the second year or third year I taught the course. And he said, I'm going to be Uber for package delivery. And I said, didn't Uber just announce they're going to start doing package delivery? Aren't they going to be Uber for package delivery? He's like, I'm going to do it better. And I'm like, okay, he's arrogant. Check. And so then I said, well, what are you going to do first? He said, I've taken a job delivering packages and I'm going to go deliver 1,000 packages before I do anything else. So I really know what I'm talking about. I'm like, okay, he's humble. Check. Because I think that combination of arrogance and humility is very powerful in entrepreneurship. And his name is Itamar Zur. He went out, he started that company, and he worked like crazy. He almost went under on a couple different occasions. He almost got deported back to Israel on a couple of other occasions. He's had incredible challenges as he worked to become the last mile of delivery. In other words, he's not to compete with UPS so much as to say to package delivery firms, whether it's Amazon or UPS or anyone else, here's the stat he told me. He said, this is a few years ago, so the numbers may have changed. For UPS to send a package from Santa Monica to my house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, costs them about $6 all in. And $3 of the $6 are getting it from Logan Airport here in Boston to my house. All the way from the UPS store in Santa Monica to the airport in Boston is $3 and then $3 more. So he's trying to deliver that last mile a little cheaper. And the pandemic hit, and suddenly everybody wanted everything delivered to their house. And his services were in incredible demand. And he grew incredibly fast. I believe the stat I saw is he raised $100 million at a $1.6 billion valuation. And he's off to the races.
Wow, awesome. Well, I think in those check boxes too, perseverance. Nothing in life is a straight line. It sounded like he had some setbacks, and it would have been very easy to fold the tent up, but you got to believe in yourself, believe in the idea, and then the stars eventually align. Maybe not all the time, but here they did. So it's a great outcome.
Yeah. That's dead right. It's worth noting, on the one hand, look, of course, the students at Harvard Business School as a group, although they have all different backgrounds, but as a group, they're plenty privileged. Even if they grew up with no privilege whatsoever, they're now privileged to be lucky enough to be here at HBS with access to the resources they do and so forth. And so it's perfectly reasonable for people who don't have those benefits to say, well, of course, these folks have an edge. On the other hand, the temptation they have is somebody will give them one hell of a great job if their entrepreneurial thing doesn't work out. And so you nailed it. I mean, it's very, very easy for them to say, you know what? This entrepreneurship is 20 hours a day, not making any money. I don't know if I'll ever succeed. And meanwhile, here's JP Morgan. They would be thrilled to give me a fantastic job. So the people who stick with it and make something amazing happen, I think deserve a lot of credit.
I agree. Before we leave the halls of higher learning, maybe your views on where education is and where it's going, and maybe we'll give Harvard a bit of a mulligan, leave them aside for the moment. And I look at my career, Randy, it spans over 40 years. And I would say for the first 30, 35, things moved glacially. But the change I'm seeing in the innovation and disruption these last 5 years, and as I look forward, and maybe we're going to touch on generative AI as well, it's moving at warp speed and training students and teaching students for careers that might exist when they're freshmen, but at the time they graduate, they're not there anymore. How much stress does that put on the educational side? And there are some big firms that are saying you don't even need to get an undergraduate degree anymore. You can come and work for us. How is this model going to sustain?
Yeah, it really is amazing. If you think about it, when I started as a professor in 1998, the teaching method we were using, the Socratic method, so-called, was probably not literally developed by Socrates, but let's just say was certainly well and skillfully used by Socrates thousands of years ago. And here we were using the same method with almost no changes. He probably even had a chalkboard. It's the same thing. So you think to yourself, my God, what other field of human endeavor do you have where there's virtually no change? Now, obviously, there's a big technological change when they invented books so that you could read books outside the classroom and then come into the classroom prepared. But that really was about it. And now you go 25 years forward, it's still not that different. We got PowerPoint, whoop-de-doo. Kudos to the engineers who develop PowerPoint. It's a good tool, but it's a little less effort than the Blackboard, but it's not clear that it's that much better for the students. But it does feel like we are on the cusp of enormous change, as with so many things in society, where it seems like, boy, for my life, I'm in my 50s, things didn't change hugely. Yeah, cars have a few more features, but they're basically the same as the cars I grew up with. It takes about the same amount of time to get from New York to LA as when I was a kid. But in education, it's starting to feel like the breakthroughs are coming on things. And I think education is one area. And I'll make a book recommendation. And the beauty is it's an incredibly entertaining novel. If anybody wants to have a good guess as to where education is going, read the book The Diamond Age by Neal Stephenson, Neal, N-E-A-L, Stephenson with a P-H, my favorite novelist. He's most famous for his book Snow Crash, where he invented the concept of the metaverse. But in the diamond age, he has a vision of our future. And it involves the AI thing too, because essentially what happens is this child gets a hold of a new technology, which has a form factor that looks similar to an iPad, and essentially teaches the child and substitutes the school because he's very poor and can't get schooling by traditional means. And this book essentially interacts with her and teaches her. And his vision is so compelling that you can really believe in it. And I was actually talking to a person who's an educational technology expert. And I said, boy, you got to give Neil Stephenson credit. He basically predicted the iPad in this book he wrote in 1995. And he said he didn't predict the iPad. And I'm like, what do you mean? The book's years of iPad's late aughts. And he said, he didn't predict the iPad. He invented it. He invented it. He said, yeah, you're not the only guy who likes Neil Stephenson. Jeff Bezos is a huge fan, and they both live in Seattle. So Bezos called him and said, this thing you have in your book, we're going to make it. And they created the Kindle. Of course, the iPad is a better version of the Kindle. And the idea, and of course, now Apple's working on these headset, which might be an even more amazing version of it. But I do think that we are going to see massive changes in how education happens. Not fast, because education is not a fast-moving field. But in the next 50 years, we may see more change than we've seen in the last 2,500 years. And that would really be something.
And maybe as a segue to the private markets, you just mentioned a couple of massive public companies. And I think in that same breath, you were speaking about innovation. And oftentimes, and I say this myself, that the home for capital formation, value creation is the private markets, full stop. But it seems like some of these very large tech firms, NVIDIA maybe as an example of AI, but what Microsoft is doing and Amazon is doing and Apple is doing, there really is a lot of innovation happening in these big public tech companies.
It's for sure. And I have one friend who's a real Silicon Valley big shot. Just a guy I knew in college, wonderful guy, was originally a private equity investor, but it led him on a fascinating career where he's had a lot of big jobs and now runs a social media platform, one of the smaller ones, he doesn't run Facebook or anything. The guy who runs Facebook's a lot younger than me. We were talking about this new Apple Vision Pro, which I think everybody is completely misunderstanding. I think it is a huge game changer. I don't mean this exact product at this exact price point, but this product as it evolves over the next decade, because people are looking for all these specialized, you can use it on the plane to be more productive on the plane. That's minor. I mean, it's great, but it's minor. What's happening here is this is the thing that's going to make remote work feel like working in an office. This is the thing that's going to make calling your nephew on his birthday feel like you're there at your nephew's birthday party. This is the thing that's going to enable my brother and me, who both love the Philadelphia Eagles football team, feel like we're sitting on the couch next to each other watching the game, even though he's in Syracuse and I'm in Cambridge. And so I think it's really quite extraordinary, the level of innovation. And what my Silicon Valley expert friend said is, nobody but Apple can make anything remotely this quality. There are so many different things you have to be good at to make a product like that. He predicted that Apple may dominate that category for 20 years. So this is not a stock pick on my part. I'm not a stock analyst, but it is very clear that a lot of amazing technology is coming out of these big public companies where you need scale to be able to do all these different things. That said, doesn't it feel like we're seeing in the tech world what we've seen for decades now in the pharma world, where what happens is a small company invents something and then the big company brings them in-house. So for example, Siri, I believe is called Siri because the company was called SRI that invented it. And I think Apple bought up that company, and now Siri is part of Apple. And so there's plenty of innovation there in the private markets. And as an investor, you can profit from those, either because that small company becomes a huge company or because that small company gets taken over by one of the big boys. So lots of ferment in the private tech markets too.
And I think another analogy to that is that everybody's talking about DeFi, but to think that TradFi is going to roll over and seed the ground. And we're going to see acquisitions happen in that place, in that space. And I think every one of these large intermediaries, the banks, the wirehouses, et cetera, maybe it's behind a curtain, but they are deep on distributed ledger and working with digital currency. So I think that it's going to be maybe an M&A game.
And I think we may have underestimated how much impact DeFi and Web3 and the other things have had already in the way that they inspired. Look, you tell me, though, you know more about this stuff than I do. But I can tell you for sure that 10 years ago, if I wanted to send a wire, it took 3 days internationally and 1 to 2 days domestically. And now it's same day. And I have to think that that's not because they're using some distributed ledger, blockchain, Bitcoin technology, but because they all got together and said, holy crap, these distributed finance people are going to eat our lunch if we don't actually make a change. It's been a nice run of being able to keep that float for a few days, but we just can't get away with it. So even the threat of competition from new technologies often can inspire legacy players to stand up and do better.
And DTCC has been experimenting with distributed ledger for many, many years in beta. And I remember going to see them as an auditor early on in my career, and you would never thought of the word innovation with the same sentence. Clearly, times are changing. So, Randy, maybe talking a little bit about private equity, and you've got a very interesting portfolio of things that you do. And I don't know if it's the very first time. No, I think the very first time I met you was in the classroom, but I've gotten to know Jean-Louis and I bump into you folks at the Standard Board, and you guys are very curious and in the mix. And Kaya produced a paper called Portfolio for the Future about a year or so ago, and we talked about some of the basic building blocks. So diversification was on there, check. Private markets is on there, check. But then also liquidity and treating that as a product feature, but maybe not a product benefit. And the reason why we made that observation is if you're taking very sophisticated product, democratizing and allowing access, and we saw this with BREIT as an example, but if the investor doesn't understand long-termism, it's not going to end so well. I think about that. That's definitely, I believe, an observation for the alpha. But I've also said, not necessarily in this report, but if we could find the vanguard of alternatives where we could just give the investor democratized beta, just so they can very cheaply get the diversification. And if you can find the alpha, that's icing on the cake. So I know that you and Jean-Louis are looking at maybe a liquid proxy for private equity. And I may have misunderstood this, and maybe I just don't even know enough about it. But it might be more of a beta than an alpha play. But maybe talk a little bit about that and maybe the progression of democratization and where you see that.
Yeah.
going.
23 years ago in 2000, I gave a speech at Andre Perel, my mentor here at HBS, Andre's investment management workshop, to a room full of top asset allocators. I was scared to death. I was a young professor, but I came in and I said, look, there's some interesting things to talk about with asset management. And one of the main things I focused on was the question of where was the alpha versus the beta in private equity? And what I concluded, what I argued, and what I then continued to argue in a series of hundreds and hundreds of speeches over the next 15, 20 years, and of course, constantly evolving as the audience gave me feedback and said, hey, Randy, you're wrong about this, but you're right about this. And I would come up with new, stronger arguments, accumulate evidence, do research. What I concluded is an awful lot of what private equity does to add value could be done in public markets. Let's oversimplify by just talking about leverage buy. Obviously, there's lots of interesting things to say about real estate, private equity, venture capital, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just pick one element, and that's leverage buyout. Because if you think about leverage buyout, they add value, I would argue, at least 6 ways. 2 of them, as a finance professor, I can't in good conscience call alpha, but they're still really important. They lever up, which enables people to have higher returns. So of course, leverage also raises risk, but still, even though a finance professor will always say, oh, you could have just levered yourself, it's often very important and valuable to have somebody else do the levering for you. So private equity firm does the levering and enables you to have a higher returning thing. If you're a pension fund trying to achieve 7.5% a year return, that is a big, big deal to you. But then in order to manage risk, they also smooth volatility. And of course, there's controversy over how the volatility of private equity is as low as it is. Last year, the S&P 500 was down, 19% or something in that neighborhood. And the Cambridge Private Equity Index was flat. And people ask, gosh, is it really possible that the values of those companies didn't fall when public markets were down so much? That said, what we know is investors love that smooth, low volatility performance profile. So that's value added for investors. And then there's things that I would classify as alpha, although it's obviously always a sliding scale between alpha and beta and things. But PE is fantastically good at picking industries. And there are great papers on this. Mark Kritzman, who was my colleague at MIT, has some wonderful work on this where he shows that if you just in the public markets copy the industry allocations of private equity, you get substantial outperformance. Private equity invests in the best kinds of companies within each industry. I have an old paper where I show that the right way to do value investing and factor investing is on a within industry basis. In other words, don't just buy all the lowest multiple stocks, because then you're going to be long all the steel companies and short all the tech companies. What you want to do is buy the low multiple steel companies and also the low multiple tech companies, even if they have higher multiples than high multiple steel companies. And so the upshot is they're buying the right companies. What are they buying? Well, what a quant would say is they buy value and quality. They buy low multiple, high profit. Because if you're trying to do an LBO, you're going to borrow 3/4 of the value of the company at something like 8% interest, maybe higher now with the rates up. 3/4 of 8 is 6. You got to pay out 6% of enterprise value every year just in interest. In order to do that, the company it just won't work unless the company is very profitable, but it also won't work unless you're buying at a reasonably low multiple. But those are exactly the companies that perform the best as high profit, low multiple. And any quant will tell you that. So PE is buying the right industries and they're buying the right companies within industry. Now, is that alpha or beta? If you say, oh gosh, there are ETFs you can buy that'll give you high profit, low multiple, so that makes it into beta. Okay, fine. All that stuff can be matched in public markets. You can match the smoothness by buying options to hedge the downside. You can match the leverage because you're going to buy a portfolio of hundreds of public companies. In other words, the crucial element here is you need to have the data. And that was only really available 3 years ago. But when that data became available on the holdings of private equity every quarter, now you can get backward-looking data on those holdings to use in back tests, and you can get it updated every quarter. So you always know what PE is doing. And then you say, you know what? These folks are super smart. I'm not so smart as they are, but I'm smart enough to copy them. So I'm going to take the data on what they hold. I'm going to use quant methods to buy a portfolio of public companies that's as similar to their, maybe they got 5,000 across all the LBO firms, 5,000 different companies, private companies. We're going to buy a portfolio, let's say, of 300 public companies that's as similar as possible to that 5,000 private company portfolio using quant methods. And then you say, we got to lever it the same amount, buy what they buy. Then you lever like they lever. Then you protect the downside using puts. And now you've captured all those sources of alpha, beta, risk control, all of it. What are you missing? Well, you're missing the operational improvements. Look, I've been sending my best students off to LBO shops for 25 years. It's one of the best jobs on Wall Street. It pays great and it's fascinating. And so they do an amazing job. They implement best practices at companies. They take local companies, national or global. They're able to do roll-up to improve margins. So they have all kinds of smart things they do. And obviously, you're not going to be able to do that stuff in the public markets because you're buying tiny slivers of hundreds of different companies. So that is a real disadvantage. And on top of that, the LBO firms have the ability to trade on inside information. It's completely legal for them to get in there and learn every secret of the company and then decide whether or not to make a bid and how much. Nobody's ever going to tell anyone like me the secrets of public companies. And if anyone ever did, I wouldn't be allowed to trade on them. So that's going to be real disadvantages. So those are legit disadvantages. Those are real edges to private equity. And moreover, it's an edge to private equity that they don't have to buy protective puts in order to make sure that they do okay in a crash. They can use mark-to-model accounting to smooth out the portfolio. So then you say, well, wait a minute. This idea of doing it in a liquid way is a disaster because on 3 different metrics, you're a little bit behind. None of them are huge, but you can't make operational improvements. You can't use inside information, and you got to pay up for insurance for protection. But you have 2 things on your side. One is you don't have to pay a control premium. Capitalism is so good at what it does. If mom and pop have a great company and a private equity firm calls them, one of my former students calls them and says, hey, I want to buy your company. I think you're awesome. Mom and pop are now smart enough to say, great, love that idea. Talk to our banker at JP Morgan. And the banker's going to say, we're going to get 6 bidders in here. We're going to get the best possible price. And we, on average, will get a control premium in excess of 30%. And so the way to look at that is, yeah, PE has edge, but some of that edge from operational improvements, in fact, a lot of it flows back to mom and pop. There's some left over for investors. That's one thing we have going for us. But even after taking account of that, if you look at the backtest of our strategy, which in my mind isn't even really a backtest because I've been talking about it publicly for 23 years. But if you look at how that strategy performs, what you'll see is it really does underperform traditional PE, traditional LBO by 3 to 6% a year on a gross basis. And that's because of those disadvantages that we talked about. But investors don't consume the gross returns. They get the net returns. And as we've seen from studies from CalPERS and others, once you add up operator fees, monitoring fees, origination fees, management fees, carried interest, private equity is charging about 700 basis points a year in fees. So if you did something that only charged 100, you'd have a 600 basis point fee gap. And that would mean that if the gross is under by 3 to 6, the net is actually 0 to 3% over on the traditional. And our view is you're not going to outperform PE. And this is where we get back to alpha and beta. The claim is not that you're going to have alpha relative to PE, that you're going to outperform PE. PE is really, really good at what they do. The goal is just to approximately match the PE index. Because if you can do that, no PE allocator is going to take $1 out of PE to put it into liquid PE, and they shouldn't. But what they should do is use it as the funding asset for their PE. When they're perfectly allocated, and then they get that call from Blackstone, and Blackstone says, hey, remember the $22 million you put into a deal 7 years ago that's been marked up to $240 million? Well, we're sending you the $240 million. And you're like, no, now I'm out of balance. I'd like to leave that money in PE, but you can't. And if you put it into a new PE fund, they're going to take 5 years drawing down the capital. So our answer is, well, we know you have to have a funding asset for that. Usually it's either cash or an index fund or 60-40. And our view is liquid PE is the perfect funding asset for private equity. And then the other use case, of course, is for high net worth folks. Let's say if you're high net worth, but not ultra, if you got $4 million and you want to put 20% in PE like an institution would, my gosh, you can't even make the minimum at one fund. And even if you have $12 million, which is pretty darn rich, and you want to put 20% in, you're barely making the minimum of two funds. You can't create a high quality, diversified portfolio of PE. And obviously, lots of people are working on solutions to this problem. And our view is liquid PE just is one in an arsenal of tools that wealth advisors should have for their investors to get access to great alt-type performance.
Just maybe two things to put an underscore, a very good explanation. And I feel like I just attended one of your lectures. But finding that top quartile manager where you could afford to maybe give up 600 or 700 basis points and still have some alpha, that is a big part of the game. Think about democratization, Randy. I think a lot of investors don't really understand IRR. When does the money get in the ground and how long does it stay there versus cash on cash return? So you could look at an IRR versus a public equity return in an index or a particular stock, and they don't mean the same thing. So I think there's a lot of education there that needs to come into play.
Two quick things. In terms of top quartile managers, we in no way, shape, or form have any ability with liquid PE to match top quartile managers. The goal is never to take any money out of your great managers and put them in liquid PE. The goal is to be in more top quartile managers by saying, hey, I've got some money. An average manager just came along. Should I invest with him? And in the old days, the answer is, well, if that funding asset was starting to pile up, maybe you have to say yes to somebody you think is average. But if you've got a funding asset that delivers average PE returns, you can say no, no, no to anybody who's average. And then when the awesome managers come along, back up the truck and go big because you didn't get stuck for 10 years in somebody who's average. And that's what's really powerful about liquid PE is it enables you to put more money into those top quartile managers. In terms of your IRR point, it couldn't be more central. If you ask 100 Wall Street folks, what does it mean to have a hot market in PE? Half of them are going to tell you, oh, hot market is when prices are really high. And half of them are going to tell you, oh, a hot market is when a lot of deals are getting done. And you know what? They're all correct. Because when markets are hot, the prices are high and deals get done. And so PE by its nature has a little bit of negative market timing. And that's where it flows through to all these IRR calculations and so forth. Because what you tend to do is get a lot of money drawn down when things are hot and prices are high. And then when it's 2009 and everything's an unbelievable bargain, PE did virtually no deals that year. And so what we say about liquid PE is we're not market timers. But liquid PE can smooth out the inherent negative market timing in PE because what's going to happen is when the market's down, things are cheap, bargains are plenty, but nobody's doing any deals. That's okay. Your money's in liquid PE. And then when the market runs back up, you will get the benefits that you would have gotten if you could have gotten PE deals done. And then at the top, when you're doing tons of deals, you have less money in liquid PE so that when the market goes over the top and starts to fall, you don't get burned by it.
It's a very practical take on the whole thing. We're running up against time, Randy, and the time where I turn to closing observations. In one direction, if you want, you could take it in. I think you've got at least one son who's entering high school, college age. And you talked about exposure to Eugene Fama and some of the things that drove your formative years. What would you say to a younger version of Randy or to your son about where you see the world going? And money does not buy happiness. It certainly helps to a large degree, but you want to be happy in your career. You want to be relevant. Right. What would you say to anybody coming out of HBS or any other university or entering high school about what they should be thinking about from a career standpoint?
I'll give you the evergreen advice that's always true, and then I'll give you the advice that's true at this moment. The evergreen advice that's always true is, it's sort of a joke, oh, do what you love. But I'm going to say to do what you love, but in a different way than other people. I'm saying that suppose your parents are pushing you to do something because this is where the money is, and you don't care about that. You want to do what you love. Go tell your parents, I'm going to do what I love, and I'm going to do it because it'll achieve your goals, parents. And this is why. Because all the biggest success in things flow to people who are the very best, who are near the very top. You don't have to be the absolute best, but who are near the top. And how do you get near the top? Well, unless you are the rarest of absurd talents, you get near the top by working like a crazy person. And how do you work like a crazy person? Well, again, unless you are a very unusual individual, the only way to get yourself to work that hard is to love what you do. And so you're better off being in the field that might be a little less what people think is going to be the lucrative field. First of all, people's guesses aren't always right. And second of all, you're better off being the top in the field that has medium prospects than being in the middle in the field that has the strongest prospects. So that's the first thing, is get into something where you're going to think about it all the time, be into it all the time, want to hang out with people who are also into it. And whatever that is, if it's cars, if it's fashion, if it's finance, if it's medicine, those are all perfectly wonderful things to pursue, but pursue the one that's meaningful to you for pure success reasons. And then it's just gravy that you'll actually enjoy your life more. Obviously, of course, you and I would agree that you should actually enjoy your life at the top of the list. But I'm saying even if you didn't, you would reach the same conclusion. Now, what about the advice for this moment? Here's what I'll say about the generative AI. What's funny is, when I was a kid, as I say, I had this combination of being good at math and good at talking. And so my parents, I remember them telling me when I was in high school, maybe, Randy, you should be a tax lawyer, because you could be a tax lawyer who's also a CPA, and that's a powerful combination, and it uses both all your skills. And that was not terrible advice, but they were kind of fighting the last war. That would have been great advice to give me if I was in high school in the 60s or 70s. By the 80s, when I was in high school, what they should have told me is, hey, Randy, go be a Wall Streeter, go to Goldman Sachs. And it would have been too early for them to talk about hedge funds. But if they said, go be a quant at Goldman Sachs, that would have been great advice. But they didn't know. And so, of course, I worry, what is it I don't know about that I should be telling kids to do? And that's exacerbated by the generative AI. Is being a lawyer a great career? Well, it's been a great career for hundreds of years. But is the generative AI going to make it that 90% of the law jobs disappear because a person who used to have a senior lawyer, 3 junior lawyers, and 5 paralegals is now going to be a senior lawyer with 1 junior legal, 1 paralegal, and ChatGPT? That is entirely possible. I honestly don't know. So here's what I can say, though, that I think is useful advice, as opposed to just saying how hard a problem it is. Get to know those tools. The best writers, if you want to be a writer, 10 years from now, you want to be a very successful journalist or novelist or whatever, get to be great at writing in partnership with generative AI. You want to be a great lawyer, you want to be a great doctor, figure out how to do diagnosis in partnership with generative AI, because that is going to be the skill. Sometimes they use the term centaurs to refer to a human and computer working combination. The chess players will say, what's better than a computer is a person and a computer working together. That is the skill set that I think is going to matter for any profession, is get to know those tools. And look, I can tell you my kids, they're somewhat resistant to it. There's a little part of them that's like, it feels like cheating, whatever. And obviously you don't want to cheat on your schoolwork, but I'm saying in terms of as you work to be a creative person, be creative using good tools. Leonardo didn't say, I'm not going to use the best paintbrushes I can get. I'm going to use crappy paintbrushes because using good paintbrushes is cheating. You want to use the best tools available to enhance your creativity. And right now, that's generative AI.
Excellent capstone. It's not either or, it's and. And I think the centaur is great advice. So, Randy, as always, I learned a ton. We packed a lot into this segment. I'll put a couple links down here to some of the things you mentioned, particularly the book. And hopefully I'll see you out in the real world doing your thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure talking to you. I look forward to seeing you.
All the best. Thanks, Randy. Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the Kaya Association and subscribe to the show at kaya.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.